Good afternoon, Brigade, visitors, and distinguished guests. My name is Midshipman First Class Chris Daves, and I'm a computer science and information technology major here at the United States Naval Academy. Throughout its history, artificial intelligence has experienced boom and bust cycles, periods of wild optimism and activity, followed by periods of disappointment and dormancy. Today, we are in a boom cycle with access to vast volumes of data, tremendous computational power, and sophisticated new techniques that allow us to do things we've never done before. But as government and industry try to understand and plan for AI and its future impacts, history shows us that it's equally important to avoid unrealistic expectations as it is to see the potential in emerging AI capabilities. This panel will seek to separate the hype from the reality and to help attendees understand how to effectively plan for a future with AI. This afternoon's panel will be moderated by Dr. Frederick Crabbe. Dr. Crabbe is a professor in the computer science department at the United States Naval Academy. In his 19-year career at the Academy, his research has focused on the intersection between artificial intelligence and robotic or similar agents. In particular, he is interested in social learning between agents, either through observation, collaboration, or various forms of explicit teaching. Professor Crabbe earned an A.B. in computer science modified with philosophy from Dartmouth College in 1992 and a Ph.D. in computer science from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2000. His current research interests include developing autonomous agents that support infantry squads and the application of AI techniques to the development of better tactics in aerial drone swarms. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Crabbe in this afternoon's panel.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this afternoon's panel, and thank you to the Naval Institute for giving us this wonderful opportunity. As Midshipman Daves has said, this is the hype versus reality, what is possible in the future panel. But first, let me introduce the panelists. Starting from my far left, we have Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. General Shanahan graduated from the University of Michigan from their ROTC program and has served in a variety of flying, staff, and command assignments. He was the director of the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, which you might know as Project Maven, where he led the Artificial Intelligence Pathfinder program. He is currently the director of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center in the Pentagon. Immediately to my left, we have Professor Missy Cummings, 1988 graduate of the Naval Academy. She was a naval aviator until 1999, that's right. She is an MS in Space Systems Engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School and a Ph.D. in Systems Engineering from the University of Virginia. She's now a professor at Duke University and director of the Humans and Autonomy Laboratory, researching human autonomous system interaction, collaboration, and the ethical impact of technology. To my immediate right is Professor Michael Kearns, professor in Computer and Information Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his BS from UC Berkeley in 1985 and a PhD from Harvard University in '89. He is a researcher in computational learning theory and algorithmic game theory, as well as the ethical impact of these disciplines. He's the co-author of a forthcoming book, I believe it's November 1st, The Ethical Algorithm, the Science of Socially Aware Algorithm Design. And to my far right is Mr. Adam Winchell, a graduate of the University of Maryland. He has worked in artificial intelligence for 20 years, starting as a researcher at DARPA in autonomous systems. He is the CEO of a newly announced startup, Arthur AI, which provides services, performance, explainability, and the detection of bias, focusing on the monitoring of deployed AI systems. So, beginning really from the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence in 1956, AI as a field has had periods of extreme optimism. Herbert Simon, an early AI pioneer and attendee at the Dartmouth conference, said that within 10 years, a digital computer will be the world's chess champion. By the mid-1960s, he claimed machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do. Marvin Minsky, another attendee, was even more optimistic, saying in 1970 that from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. This optimism, combined with the lack of any real results, led to a spectacular crash, now dubbed the first AI winter. Research funding dried up worldwide, and pessimism regarding progress was now much more common. Yet by the early 1980s, the hype machine was back in motion, with early successes of expert systems and what we then called connectionism. Despite warnings from the survivors of the first AI winter, there was significant new energy, investment, and yes, hype. The collapse of the Lisp machine market around 1987 usually marks the beginning of the second AI winter, with similar pessimism and loss of funding. Currently, we are seeing a great deal of hype in the media regarding AI, mostly surrounding deep learning, which we heard about earlier today several times. And we're getting used to hearing comments such as Google CEO Sundar Pichai saying, AI is one of the most important things humanity is working on. It is more profound than, I don't know, electricity or fire. And if you think that's just an off-the-cuff exaggeration, Berkeley's Stuart Russell wrote in the New York Times earlier this month, the arrival of superhuman machine intelligence will be the biggest event in human history. Jeffrey Hinton, who is perhaps the person most largely responsible for the deep learning resurgence, told the New York Times, the point about this approach is that it scales beautifully. Basically, you just need to keep making it bigger and faster, and it will get better. There's no looking back now. The obvious question we face now is, are we in another hype cycle, and are we approaching our third AI winter? Or is there something fundamentally different this time? What really is the state of AI? So I'd like to begin with General Shanahan. Military funding, or the lack thereof, has been a key factor in the AI hype cycle. You were responsible for accelerating the delivery of artificial intelligence-enabled capabilities, which makes it seem as if the military is bullish right now on the prospects of AI. How capable are the current or near-term future military AI technologies? And are you at all hedging your bets against possible disappointments?
I am bullish generally on the future just because I'm watching the world explode in commercial industry. Now, that brings the challenge I have is how far behind we are when I look at the advances, rapid advances of where commercial industry is in artificial intelligence. But in general, I'm very bullish on it. There is no part of the Department of Defense that cannot benefit from artificial intelligence, used as a very broad term, whether we talk machine learning, reinforcement learning, natural language processing, process automation, or all subsets therein. Every part of the Department of Defense will benefit from artificial intelligence. So I'm bullish on it, but on the other side of this equation, as a department, this feels so different culturally that we have a long way to go to really embrace the speed and the scale of what's happening in commercial industry. When I walk in the doors of the Pentagon every day, I face the unenviable situation of trying to act like a startup organization in the institutional bureaucracy known as the Pentagon. Those at its very core seem to be fundamentally disconnected. There are a lot of people who want to go forward very quickly with artificial intelligence capabilities in the department, but we live by 5-year budget cycles and weapon system milestones that are measured in 5 to 10-year increments, as opposed to how quickly can I take an algorithm, update it, and put it back into the field. Can I do that hourly based on what we see in our personal electronic devices, or do I have to wait 1 or 2 years? If we do everything right and we field an algorithm, let's say for an Intel analyst down in Afghanistan, if we then don't update that algorithm for another 6 months, it might as well not have been fielded in the first place. So there are so many challenges associated with moving at the speed of commercial industry. We have a long way to go. But I am bullish about it. From the Secretary of Defense on down, the language is consistent. We understand that AI is critical to the future of national security. We have to move, and we have to move quickly. Are we moving fast enough? I'm never going to be satisfied by the pace of change right now, but that's as much a cultural question as it is one of talent management and a data problem. And I face all of those together every day. But in terms of how fast can we move, always can move faster. The conditions are right now for really begin to embrace this, unlike any time I've ever seen in the past. We have the right personalities in place to do it. Now we need the budgets behind it to show long-term stability in what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. Professor Cummings, you have written in the past some skeptical comments about the actual fieldability of current AI systems regarding the brittleness. So where do you think we are in terms of AI development? Is AI ready now or in the future for actual deployment?
So I think it's interesting to make sure that we define what is AI and what is automation. And I think that for people who are not experts in this field, it's easy to conflate those together. So automation, I would consider to be rules-based processing of an algorithm. And rules-based processing, automation is what's happening in most of the places in the military in terms of fielded systems. Artificial intelligence really kicks in when algorithms have to reason under uncertainty. And so this is when you start to see neural nets, machine learning, where the computer has to make guesses about the world that it sees around us. And so when we talk about automation, I think a lot of people forget that the military led the field in the 1990s with the tactical Tomahawk, or the Tomahawk missile just in general. The Tomahawk missile has amazing, I would say, elementary AI and pattern recognition inside the warhead. And so for a long time, and that missile still today is really an amazing capability. That's other than perhaps a little tiny bit of artificial intelligence inside some unmanned aerial vehicles, particularly when we talk about the Global Hawk or Predator-like UAVs. There's really not a lot of true AI in the military today fielded. That's not to say it's under development. And I would move to another country if I really thought that it was fielded, and I'll tell you why. The scariest thing I've heard this week is whoever the head of missile defense said he was going to put AI inside of missile defense systems. And the answer is no. No, you shouldn't. Don't let him do that. Let me tell you, AI is so deeply flawed. The bulk of AI development is not happening in the military, and this is actually why I think we're in a different place in today's world than we were in the other two AI winters that you're talking about. There's no question that the bulk of AI development is happening in the commercial sphere. The military is way, way, way behind. I appreciate that the general says he's got some talent, but I'm telling you, he doesn't have enough. And I think you would agree with me on this, that the military so badly needs to up its game in the AI field. Most of the AI development is happening in the commercial sphere. Driverless cars is probably the best example that you can think of on your day-to-day basis. I would suggest that you all watch PBS Nova tomorrow night, because I have a big special coming out where it's me versus everyone else in the driverless car community talking about just how bad this technology is. It is the open secret that professors and other people in AI companies do not talk about, is that this technology is still at a technology readiness level of 3 or below. It is still very much basic technology that is under development, and it is not ready to be fielded. And when I say this technology is not ready to be fielded, I'm specifically talking about any true artificial intelligence that is going to start reasoning on its own using computer vision specifically, or maybe some related technologies. Stuart Russell, who you heard from before, is a friend of mine. He and I have known each other for years. He and I definitely diverge on this point. We could not be farther away from general artificial intelligence. It's not happening. We're not close. I would never get into a driverless car that any of my students ever programmed, because I know how bad my students are, and any of your students, and because students make mistakes all the time. On the plane here, I was reading about an algorithm that my student developed, and he forgot to check a basic premise of the underlying data. That is the most common mistake that students are making today, and it's not just students, it's people in the field. So I'm sorry it's a really long answer, is to say, I'm a techno-realist. AI is important. It is going to be important for future developments. But any of the hysteria that is going along about, that it's overly capable is not true. But also what I worry about from the military perspective is that we don't really have a way to do test and development and certification to actually understand that when Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or Google or any other company come to us and tell us that they have this capability, we really don't have the capability in-house, in the military, in the DoD, to actually assess whether or not they're telling us the truth.
Okay. Okay, thank you. One quick clarification. You mentioned that the current level is 3 or below of AI. Could you describe briefly what that scale is?
Okay, so the technology readiness levels. This is like a readiness of how mature the technology is. And when I'm talking about this technology, I'm specifically talking about computer vision-based technologies that are making decisions on their own. So we could say driverless cars, but it could be drones with these systems. It could be weapon systems with these, with any kind of computer vision, target recognition systems. The bottom line is we still don't really understand how neural nets do what they do. So anything that you hear about deep learning, neural nets, machine learning, this is still very much in the sphere of research at universities. For example, we just found out there's something called adversarial machine learning. We just found out in the last couple years that I could print out a sticker to put on a stop sign. It looks like a stop sign, and I can change 1 pixel in that stop sign and trick a computer vision algorithm on a driverless car to not see the stop sign, but to instead see a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit sign, right? So this is brand new learning that we're doing about these systems, and I would actually push this back, and of course I'm going to say that AFOSR and ONR and the other agencies don't have enough funding in this field. But as academics, if we're learning brand new things about a technology that you think you want to field, and we're learning that it's passively vulnerable, we still have a lot of learning to do before we're ready to certify these systems as safe for operational deployment. And I don't know if you said this, and I know about that because I was in the military after I graduated in 1988 from 30th Company. I flew A4s and F-18s. So I've been there, I've been in the fleet, I know what it's like, and I know that what we don't need are technologies that we don't know what they're capable of.
Okay. I think I'll give you a chance in a minute to, you might have some things to say in response. But first I'd like to turn to Professor Kearns. Now you've been writing about the creation of algorithms in an ethical manner, and this was already the question. At the same time, most of what was going on in these AI these days is deep learning, which is this inscrutable black box. We have this adversarial learning going on as well. So could you comment on the ethical issues surrounding deployment, either military, government, or corporations of an AI system where we can't predict it and they seem to be fairly brittle?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I might say is that in discussions around kind of the brittleness of AI or issues of privacy or discrimination in such systems, I often find that even in technical audiences, but especially in general audiences, many things kind of get confused and kind of mangled together. So in particular, when people talk about deep learning, for instance, being inscrutable and sort of incomprehensible black box, I think it's helpful to break down what the scientific principles underlying deep learning are. And in particular, if I had slides, which I don't, one of the things I like to do is put up the Wikipedia pseudocode snippet for the backpropagation algorithm, which is basically the underlying algorithm for training neural networks, including in the deep learning era. And it's about 10 lines long, and it's doing the most basic, principled, sensible thing that you could imagine doing. It is tuning the parameters of a model to minimize some objective function on the data, usually having to do with predictive error. So when people talk about deep learning being inscrutable, they shouldn't mean that. So if there's any inscrutability that comes, it's from the complexity of that algorithm operating on very complicated data and producing a very, very high dimensional output that we don't understand well. And that I agree with, but when you think about things through this lens, it leads you to a couple of conclusions. One of them is that if that 10 lines of pseudocode is the source of so much gnashing and wailing and angst, maybe we should think about fixing those 10 lines of pseudocode in the first place before we start panicking about, dystopian things like the singularity or calling for better laws and regulation, which I agree that we need, but that's going to be slow. And so, in particular, I think if the audience doesn't know it already, kind of a secret of the machine learning community is that actually the underlying principles of machine learning are incredibly simple and sensible, and they largely revolve around optimization. So you basically write down an objective function and you say, I want to minimize squared error, I want to minimize training error, I want to maximize likelihood, whatever. And then you have some search for the model that optimizes that objective function. And the reason I kind of bother to say something slightly technical is that when I put it like that, it shouldn't surprise you that when you optimize for some specific objective function, you shouldn't expect to get anything else for free. You shouldn't expect to get fairness for free. You shouldn't expect to get privacy for free. You shouldn't expect to get transparency for free. You shouldn't even expect to, when you train a vision algorithm to distinguish between stop signs and something else, you shouldn't be surprised when it could be fooled by adversarially chosen examples, okay? So this also, I think, kind of points out how narrow the field is in some ways. So the strides in machine learning and deep learning have been phenomenal, and there's been great empirical and commercial success. But at the end of the day, there's nothing close to sort of general purpose intelligence going on here. You have very well-trained scientists and engineers saying, okay, the problem is to distinguish between cats and dogs, or the problem is to detect this command in Alexa versus that command in Alexa. And I'm not disrespecting any of those advances, but these are incredibly narrow goals. And when you have incredibly narrow goals and you optimize for them, you shouldn't expect sort of intelligence to magically emerge, and so it doesn't. And furthermore, all of this collateral damage around ethical issues does emerge. In the book that you mentioned with my colleague Aaron Roth, we try to explain some of this to a general audience. But most of our book is actually, again, kind of technological optimism, in the sense that, when you look at it through this lens, you realize that algorithms can be made better in the first place. So for instance, if I'm worried about a consumer lending model built with deep learning exhibiting racial discrimination, I don't have to kind of scratch my head and say like, oh wow, how did that happen? What are we going to do about this? This is terrible. You can go change the objective function. You can say, instead of minimizing the training error, period, minimize the training error subject to the constraint that no racial group has a false rejection rate that is significantly higher than any other racial group. And it's basically, a very similar problem. It's again an optimization problem. It's just a constrained optimization problem. But then the next, piece of this story is that you shouldn't expect, if you minimize the training error under a constraint like fairness, that your error will be as good as it was if you didn't have that constraint, right? So what I'm saying is practically a tautology, right? If I train a neural network and I don't put any fairness constraints in it, I'll get some error on the training data and out of sample. And then if I engage in that same exercise, but with the additional constraint of no racial discrimination, I should expect my error to be worse in the second case. And so an important message here is that you can make the algorithms better, but then there are going to be trade-offs. You're going to have to start deciding how much loss and error, which basically translates to performance or revenue for a company like Amazon, how much error am I willing to sacrifice in exchange for how much fairness, okay? And how you decide what that trade-off should look like, of course, should matter greatly depending on the application, right? So, if it's, say, gender bias in Google advertising, maybe we don't care that much about fairness because, people generally aren't looking at the ads for the most part anyway. If it's racial bias in criminal sentencing, maybe we care a lot about that, right? And so we might want to sacrifice more in overall accuracy in exchange for more fairness. Of course, in an application like that, sort of a loss in overall accuracy means either more innocent people being incarcerated or more guilty people being freed. And so, society has to make the decision about those costs. But a lot of these things can be made scientific. And, the other, I think, piece of news here is that we know how to do this. This is now a large sub-community of the AI machine learning community. You might wonder why you're not hearing about, solutions like this to improved algorithms being widely deployed. It's not because, I'm not claiming that every problem is solved, but the reason you're not seeing widespread deployment isn't because we don't know how to approach these things scientifically. It's mainly a matter of companies and other organizations having the appetite to engage in these trade-offs.
Great. Well, that's an excellent segue to Mr. Winchell. Your company provides solutions for monitoring AI systems, maintaining explainability, and reducing bias. So what are the techniques, what are the best techniques that we have now for achieving that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for starters, we agree very much with what Dr. Kern said, and it is, we take a very pragmatic approach to this, and the platform we build and that our customers take advantage of is essentially shining a light and measuring that these factors so that you can make an informed decision and you can decide on a case-by-case basis within your organization, how do I want to trade accuracy? What are my fairness goals? Because there's a lot of nuance in the way you do those fairness goals, and there are a lot of trade-offs that come with all of them. And so, when we talk to people, they actually want to have algorithms that are fair, especially if they're in a regulated industry. I spent the last 3 years leading the AI division for a Fortune 100 bank, heavily regulated industry. But even outside of that, people who are in a very different industries, they want to have fair algorithms. And they also want to have robust ones. So the example that Professor Cummings gave around the stop sign, using we heard about explainability earlier. One of the things that explainability tell you if you're using it for computer vision is you can look at a picture of a 45 mile an hour sign, and when you ask the algorithm to explain itself using some common explainability techniques, it'll say like, hey, I'm really only looking at these 5 pixels right there, which is the way the researchers knew that if they put a piece of tape on that stop sign in that exact right spot, it would key off that. And so, explainability isn't just to kind of feel good that your system's operating correctly. It actually allows you to make your system much more robust and do things like in that case, you can actually say, all right, we need more examples of a 45 mile an hour signs that maybe don't have those pixels in that exact spot so that our algorithm, our model, gets a more complete understanding of what a 45 mile an hour sign looks like, or even take a picture of a 45 mile an hour sign and gray out those pixels or put noise over them so to make your system much more robust and not vulnerable to those kind of weaknesses. And so, we take a very pragmatic approach. People want to do the right thing. It's just that it's been kind of unaddressed in the market, and so we work on providing tools that allow people to build these systems in a more robust way. And then once they're in production, to monitor them so that they don't just, it's not just a one-time kind of measure it in the lab and then put it in the real world and trust that it's performing the same way, but to actually be able to measure them on an ongoing basis.
Okay, thank you. So let's, actually, I did just say I would give General Shanahan a chance to rebut since he got called out there a couple times.
I wouldn't call it rebutting. I don't actually disagree with any of Missy's core conclusions. We have this massive talent gap right now that is going to be a multi-generational solution. Some of it will be upskilling internal, some will bring in outside help. We have a big cultural challenge that we have years to get through. We also have a major data challenge. Why do we have such a data challenge? We're a hardware-driven industrial age organization trying to figure out how to become a software company in the information age. Those are massive problems for the Department of Defense to take on. Where I will say, I'll qualify one piece of this is, we have a choice. We can sit and continue to admire the problem, or we can decide we have to start fielding something and figure out through user engagement from the very beginning, which has been core to what Maven has done, is core to what we're trying to do in the Jake, is from the very beginning with the software engineers have user engagement, give them a minimal viable product. Special Operations Command, being who they are, screams, give us the capability now. I know it's a 45 to 50% performing algorithm. We will tell you what we need to make it better. But now I'll back to be in complete agreement. We're not doing that by saying, field it, take the humans out, take 5,000 analysts and remove them and put them somewhere else. This is still humans watching the machines perform and humans machines figuring out what's the right combination for a legacy system never designed for AI. How do we make that better and better? That's an iterative process. And in Maven, they're now on 2.5 years of continuous updates to algorithm. Still far below what I think anybody would be satisfied by saying, take the person out of the seat and drive the car autonomously. Nobody's ready to do that right now. So there is a lot that has to be done, and we're working on the test and engineering side, test and evaluation, validation, and verification. We have a long way to go on that. The Department of Defense was not made to do T&E and V&V for algorithms, so there's a long way to go there. My job in the JAIC is to get product out in the field, and this is what commercial industry does very well, is deliver product. So by working closely with commercial industry and internal to the department, how can we get minimal viable products out with humans watching it very closely and then getting it better and better so the time we get to some time frame, and this may be a 3-year return on investment question, we're satisfied it's actually performing at or above humans. I haven't seen that yet happen, I'll be honest with you, and we're a ways from doing that. So I don't actually take exception to anything she said. I'm chartered to just get out and let's move it rather than keep it on the research side of the house.
Thank you. Okay, let's switch a little bit to thinking a little more longer term. Professor Cummings, where do you think we will be 15 or 20 years out in terms of AI and its readiness? And will we still be, is deep learning still the primary thing, or will we have hybrid systems, or do you think something else will come along?
So I think these are excellent questions, and I'm going to pull together what I think is going to happen in the military and the civilian world, because I think these things are inexplicably linked. So I think in the next year, you're going to see the AI winter of cars. I think we're on the verge of seeing driverless car. They're not going to go away, but I think you're going to see a recentering of focus. I think car companies are hemorrhaging cash at such levels right now to try to get the AI to a place that they believed that was possible, that is just not held up by science. And so I think that is going to have kind of a whiplash effect. So when the AI community dries up for driverless cars, in the next year, and I mean really kind of the fact that you are not going to get your driverless car that's going to take you to Las Vegas, for example. I think that you're going to see other companies come in, and there's going to be this snapping up of talent. So General, this will be a good time next year when all the car companies go out of business. This is a good time to go try to, and I can tell you right now, companies like Amazon, they're hanging out on the edges, and they know this is not a huge secret inside the community. So people understand that there's about to be a big shift in technology. So how does that relate to AI in general? I think if I could give you a slide, which I also appreciate that I don't have, I would say we're on the Gartner hype cycle, and if you've never seen that, you really should take a look at it. The Gartner hype cycle really has a huge peak of expected, inflated expectations, and then a long drop-off where people get really depressed and the Zoloft comes out, and then we kind of have a slow rise back up to what they call, the plateau of enlightenment. So I think we're not quite at the big drop. I think the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to see a big drop in expectations of AI based around computer vision. And then I think we're going to start coming out on this plateau of enlightenment of where people starting to understand where AI is and is not. And I think one of the things that and I'm going to say this as the director of the Humans and Autonomy Laboratory, which yet not one person today noticed my necklace with the how. Right, oh, that's what it is, right? So from the Space Odyssey 2000, look, the future is really one of collaboration. We are not, in the next 15 years, AI is not going to start rampantly replacing people. It's not going to replace processing, exploitation, and dissemination. It's not going to replace pilots out of airplanes. It's not going to replace drivers, taxi drivers. Robots are not coming for your job. What AI is going to take on in this plateau of enlightenment is an appreciation that humans are good at out-of-the-box reasoning. Computers are really good at processing lots of information and maybe seeing patterns that didn't exist before. And we're going to start to see a coming together of unique talents. I would call out a DARPA program that I recently finished with a company called Aurora Flight Sciences, now owned by Boeing, where they had a co-pilot robot powered by all kinds of AI that assisted the pilot. So we were able to get rid of the right seat pilot, put a robot arm, have the pilot talk to the robot arm to help the pilot under periods of high workload, and then when the pilot needed to bring his or her judgment under areas of high uncertainty, problems with engines, problems with weather, then the pilot comes in to do what he or she does best. So that's where I think we're going to see in the future.
Okay, thank you. Professor Kearns, so in the same time frame, what do you think the ethical developments will be? What are the ethical risks? Is there some bad choices we could make? Is there a dystopian future possible?
Well, I think we're already making bad choices, so we don't need to wait 15 years for that. So, I mean, you know, look, I think just to get at some of the comments that were made before, I agree there's going to be some kind of downturn, at least in the expectations around AI, especially the expectation that we're going to kind of continue to see the same rates of advance on fields that are now kind of, you know, we're no longer at the low-hanging fruit anymore. You know, you look at many vision tasks and, you know, you're kind of approaching the ceiling of perfect prediction, at least on the limited task that's been defined. So, you can't have growth of a company forever. At some point, it's got to move from like a growth stock to a value stock, right? And so I think for a lot of areas of AI and machine learning, that day is coming. And, given that you cannot pick up, the Wall Street Journal and not read about these things today, it's inevitable that people are going to say like, okay, the hype is off now. And I think that would actually be a very healthy thing. As somebody who, I guess I lived through the first two AI winters and didn't really even realize they were happening because I didn't really notice the springs in between either. I don't think, I agree with comments that have been made before, the huge difference here is that, in the first AI springs, there really weren't products. Right? There weren't, with some exceptions, there weren't widely, massively deployed products based on AI and machine learning, and entire companies that, are essentially machine learning companies like your Google, your Amazon, your Facebooks. In terms of the ethical issues, right, I think these are going to be with us, I think that's a growth industry because the ethical issues, even when they're broadly the same, they're different in every different industry. So, as he mentioned, some industries have very, very strong regulations, and there are very restrictive, regulations about what you can and cannot do. So, for example, in many consumer lending and finance settings, you're forbidden from using race as an input to a predictive model, even though explicitly forbidding the use of race as an input to your model might force you to result in a more discriminatory model. So I think, and as I said before, right, the stakes in different industries is very different, sort of what you're trading off against and also what is meant by fair. One of the stark secrets of the study of algorithmic fairness, which I think you were alluding to, is that, I can, if we had time, I could describe to you, three different entirely sensible definitions of fairness that all of you would agree with, yes, that's a reasonable thing to ask for. And then, there are these theorems that say, well, guess what? You just mathematically cannot simultaneously achieve all three of those definitions at the same time. So I think that, the ground is still very, the science of studying things like fairness in algorithms and fairness and privacy and decision making is still in its relative infancy compared to the advances that have been made in the vanilla applications of AI and machine learning. And so I think, we have a lot of work ahead of us in this area. And so maybe it's a good thing that sort of the purely applied side kind of slows down a bit and the hype comes off so that, people working on the ethical aspects of it can kind of catch up to the use of technology in industry and in the field these days.
Okay, thanks. So that's a good segue to you, Mr. Winchell. So from your perspective in business, we're talking about products. What do you think the long-term prospects are?
Actually, before we go into that, I just wanted to, I know you said you didn't feel the effects of the AI winners of the springs, but I started in AI in the late 90s, kind of on the thawing of the second AI winner. And I can remember at that time when you told people you wanted to go into AI, getting comments like, "Oh, AI, that's interesting. You're really good at predicting the past, aren't you?" And when you're getting mocked by your fellow computer scientists, you have to wonder about your career choices. But it all worked out in the end. But in terms of where the industry is heading, I think that this is something that industry is wrestling with, these issues of fairness and robustness, and being able to really kind of control the AI and make sure it's working as well in the real world as it does in the laboratory. And I think that's going to be a huge focus. I do think, as others have said, we are definitely at the top of a hype curve. But the difference between this is we're seeing real commercial value this time around, and that's something we haven't seen on this scale in the past. And so while there will be kind of a big tamping down of expectations, people aren't going to throw out what's working, and there's too many companies making huge gains, and that's not going to go away. So I do think there'll be what's the trough of disillusionment in the Gartner cycle, but there are very real results this time. And what I think is going to happen is the real results right now, which are actually still fairly concentrated among kind of big tech companies, will over time begin to be enjoyed by a much broader section of the world.
Okay, so General Shanahan, do you see the same sorts of things moving forward as the rest of the panel, or do you have a different perspective?
Generally, the same view. I just don't know. I think there's so many unknowns right now. That's what I said, we've got to dive in and do it. But in terms of what we took on and why we took it on, I think it brings in a couple of the different panelists' comments, is we start with low consequence use cases for a reason. People ask, why predictive maintenance? Why humanitarian assistance? Because they're very narrow, they were bounded. We knew at least the starting point of the problem, and we could actually see, is it beginning to show results or not? We started talking mission critical in the Department of Defense, safety. Not only do I agree on the missile defense, but NC2 was used in a War of the Rocks article about a dead hand solution for AI and nuclear command and control. No, thank you very much. I think that's not where any of us are interested in heading right now. But in terms of general patterns, what we're trying to do is just keep up with where the industry is going. It's moving so fast. I mean, it's breathtaking, the developments as they unfold in commercial industry, at the same time taking advantage of those and bringing those into a department that's not used to working in the acquisition and contracting mechanisms at that speed. We're getting better at it thanks to places like Defense Digital Service, Defense Innovation Unit, Kessel Run, and others, that we're getting better at it, but we have to even move faster. At the same time, taking advantage of what's happening in academia. I'm seeing more academic research that can be left into, if not fielding, then to get closer to it than it was just a couple of years ago. So the idea of the government, academia, and industry staying well enough connected to keep apprised of what's happening, what's unfolding in the two other parts of that triangle, because as much as is happening, it's very encouraging in the research labs of the military. We can never, ever match the investment commercial industry putting some of these technologies. We just have to take advantage of it. It's not one or the other. It's going to be all three of us working together in different mission sets. But when you start talking the real mission critical, life or death decisions, not only will we move slowly, I think there's great cause for skepticism about what those results will show over what time frame.
All right, this one I'll just open to anyone in the panel who wants to step in. Earlier this month, Stuart Russell published an op-ed in the New York Times that partly discussed some of the dangers of AI, from impacts from like the job market to media misinformation, and even kind of hinted at Skynet or Matrix style scenarios. And for me, this raised a question: what is the likelihood of an actual new AI winter that arises not from a technological perspective and technology failure, but from technology successes that scare the populace and lead to an actual human population backlash?
I'm always happy to comment on this if nobody else wants to jump in there. So I talk all around the world. And I talk to people from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life. And I think that it is easy to scare people with stories of out-of-control robots, the Terminators, the Matrixes of the future. I think that there's actually a lot of irresponsibility in doing so, especially when the technology is so far from reality. So, and I again, Stuart and I, we agree to disagree on these points. But anyone in here have a Tesla? Maybe one or two. If you have not seen the hilarious spate of Tesla summon debacles happening across the internet, this is, the latest artificial intelligence that is the most commonly accessible AI that you can have in a car. It doesn't work. Tesla's summon, where you actually can try to call the car and have it find its way to you, it doesn't work at all, and these are at slow speeds. All right, it works a little bit under very, very controlled conditions, but it has a lot of problems. The only killer robot in the world today that could affect you is, again, a Tesla on the highway at high speeds and autopilot, right? So these are real-world examples. That is AI. There is a ton of AI embedded in Teslas, and they do not work. Google/Waymo has had the ability, the authority, to do driverless car operations in California and Arizona for almost 2 years now, yet they have never actually deployed cars in these settings. They have not done so because they know that the cars do not work, because the cars suffer from very many similar problems that the Teslas suffer from. The technology doesn't work. We're not ready. I'm not saying that it's never going to work. We need a lot more engineering. And, in this point, General, I thought the one great thing is, it's not always great to be number one. In this case, I think it's good that the commercial development is happening in AI, because we are receiving their benefits. We are having a lot of lessons learned without having to spend the cash.
Right on.
And doing so. If there is one more death due to driverless car testing, like what happened in Tempe, Arizona, it's going to shut the whole industry down in a big way. And so when we look at the real world examples that we see around us, including examples like Watson. Watson supposedly had this amazing AI to do predictive health analytics. It had to be shut down. There are many lawsuits pending against IBM right now from hospitals that are suing IBM for bad AI for healthcare applications. That is it has nothing to do with computer vision. And even in this much less time-critical scenario, AI is failing us. It's not failing us in any way that we didn't expect it to fail. We know about these cases. We've anticipated these cases. So I do think that we need to be careful going ahead, and this is why I think the General is right. I think people in the military are wary for good reason. Nobody's interested in having AI tied in safety-critical systems. My one big concern going forward into the future, it's both in the military and commercial spheres, are the hype around it and the fact that people in the the CEO suites, what we call the C-suites, and generals, of course not this general, that they say things that they don't understand, right? That they make claims that we're going to embed. I hear it all the time. In fact, here's the triumvirate of stuff I do not want to hear in one sentence. AI, deep learning, blockchain. Don't put those in the same sentence, because it makes me know that you don't know what you're talking about. And then the new one on the street is quantum. Please don't say that. It hurts me.
So, do you mind if I follow up briefly?
Oh, please, absolutely.
So just to follow up on Missy's comments, but by the way, it must drive you nuts because I see those sentences every day. Stuart Russell notwithstanding, I find that in general, the more people know about how AI and machine learning work, the less frightened they are that the robots are about to become our overlords. And so I think when people engage in these kinds of narratives or speculation, I don't dismiss it entirely, but I think, it's really a question about the rate of progress, right? So, you can look at the state of the art today and you can just see that, the deep neural networks of the world are not going to self-organize overnight and we're going to wake up in chains. That's just not going to happen. And so, if there's going to be some sort of event or future in which something dystopian like that happens, it's really a question of what's the path by which that could happen from where we are right now? And what's the real fear, right? I think one legitimate fear is that, it's foolish to sort of look at where we are today and look at the rate of change and progress where we are today, and to exclude the possibility that that would increase so rapidly that we would essentially lose control of AI and AI-based systems, not in sort of the narrow sense, but in the societal sense. And there are scenarios under which that could happen, but it really requires quite a bit of speculation. It really requires not just sort of progress like we've seen in the last 10 years, which I think I agree with my fellow panelists is sort of an order of magnitude greater progress than in any decade in the field since. It would need to be yet orders of magnitude greater for us to sort of not realize this was happening to us and be able to react as a society in time. So, while I think it's fashionable to worry about these kind of dystopian outcomes, as a scientist, it seems like kind of a parlor game to me in the sense that it's so at odds with where we actually are technically that it reads like a Ray Bradbury story to me.
Okay.
The only thing I'll say to that is to people who assume the department has the killer robots hidden away in the basement, come see what we have. You'll be worried about dystopia in the other direction. That's all you've got. That's where we're
Even
facing
in Area
right
51?
Yeah, and I think, the real problem is it distracts from the very real problems that are happening all day, every day, and whether it's kind of bias in things like deciding unemployment benefits or medical claim dispensations, or, very real uses of AI that are affecting society through like social media impersonation and things like that, which are actually having really profound effects on our country and national defense and things like that. This other stuff, not that it's shouldn't be considered, and it should definitely be thought about, but in proportion to the actual threat, and it's way out of proportion right now.
Okay, so I want to take three quick polls here. I think I know the answer to the first one based on everyone's comments, but so most of the news the question is most of the news that you read about in the media today hype, or is it real? So why don't we just go, what do you think? Is it mostly hype now, or?
It depends on where you're getting your news, but there's quite a lot of hype. Yeah, the headlines are pretty comical a lot of times about AI.
All right.
I generally feel like, the mainstream media has done a reasonably good job at, kind of reporting an important scientific trend and kind of capturing what's going on with it commercially. So I don't, it's not like when I pick up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Wired or whatever that I look at this and say, oh, this is just complete garbage. A lot of times the details are wrong. I think these things are very cyclical, right? I mean, journalism is very cyclical. So, for a while when you read about machine learning, it was all about this amazing successes of deep learning and this grand era that we live in. Now there's a lot of articles about the sort of things that we work in, about the backlash, right? And so, it's hard for me to fault the media in particular within this hype, because I think, their job is to report interesting stories that are of broad interest. So, I'm kind of in between, I think.
Okay.
I'm clearly talking to less informed people in the media than you're talking to. I need to.
I'm mainly, I'm even talking about the articles I read, both things that I've interacted with the journalists or been part of the story. In general, I think it's reasonably balanced for what it's meant to be. Journalists are not scientists, right? They're not, they're not there to sort of convey the details of the science. They're there to tell a story. And I think they've, looked at through that lens, I don't think they're doing a bad job given what their job description is.
Well, I see a bimodal distribution. I see there are some people out there, Wired magazine, I think New York Times, Washington Post, will call me a lot and try to get the details right. But, your average American will not spend more than a couple of minutes reading an article. So I think that a lot of the news organizations try to pander to what sells, what the click hype is, and I think that kind of goes off the chart. But I could blame them, and I don't think it's their fault. I could blame the generals and the CEOs, and actually it's not their fault either. I will tell you who I hold responsible for the hype, and it's really academics. And I think that there are a lot of academics, I won't name any, but you could point to several around the country who have really oversold their technologies and keep overselling their technologies to compete in the startup hype. And I actually think it's academia who needs to take a long look at itself in the mirror, because what happens is academia wants to raise as much money as possible to keep doing their pet projects. And so most academics will not tell the funding agencies the truth. I see a couple of program managers from various organizations in the audience. They have never gotten a proposal that said, you know what AI can't do? It can't do any of these things, right? Because they want to get money for funding. The whole Epstein debacle at MIT is just a great example of that. Academic institutions are not immune to the selling of the hype. And it is that selling of the hype that then gets into the C-suite, that comes out to the military. And so, you know, I don't really have a hard solution to that, except that I would turn to the general, I would turn to the funding agencies, and I would say, we really do need to, when it comes to AI, start a funding line of people to do almost like red team, blue team exercises. And DARPA is getting better about that. I do think we're starting to see some proposals integrate that. But testing and certification, for example, gets almost no funding in terms of research. That's considered, oh, that's operational testing, that's not research, we shouldn't fund it. We should definitely be funding that, because understanding how to do an acceptance test for anything with AI, industry doesn't know how to do it, commercial industry doesn't know how to do it, and if they don't, the military's not going to know. And without us understanding that sometimes you have to fund the process, not the cool, sexy thing, but the process around the development of the thing, and that's going to be important for safety and efficiency for commercial and military systems.
Thank you.
And the only thing I'd add to what's already been said is, like any institution, the media is not monolithic. The tech reporters are always been doing this beat for 40 plus years. On the mainstream, there are a number of journalists and reporters that really are working hard to understand it. And from my point of view in the department, if we don't help shape those stories are going to be written anyway. So I want to be able to get out and be a little bit more transparent and be realistic about what we can, and as was said earlier by at least one or two of you, what it cannot do. I think we have to be upfront that we don't oversell it internally to the department, to reporters. I always try to engage in a way that is frank about the good, the bad, the unknowns, where we still need to go. Without doing that, the stories are going to be written, and it will be without the benefit of the facts behind it.
All right, thank you. So we've come to the end of the period of my questions, and we're now ready to take questions from the audience. We have microphones up there and there. If you'd like to make your way. I guess you're lined up there first.
Hi, yes, my name's Dan. I work for a DoD-sponsored project called Mitigations in Adversarial Machine Learning. And a lot of what I heard today about deployments of machine learning or AI, I heard mission critical and not mission critical, really to me centers around a risk-reward type of framework. But I didn't hear that terminology used at all. Part of the project that we're looking at is how to assess the risk of certain types of implementations of machine learning based on the decision support. So I wanted to hear if you thought that framing whether or not you should implement machine learning for your decision support fit into a risk-reward type of framework or cost-benefit, or what would you like to call it?
I'll start, but I expect some others will have more to say. I think we have a decent idea of the risk. I can't show the rewards right now on mission critical systems, on decision support. Every single combatant command right now wants help in decision support systems. How can I do an operational plan in 2 weeks instead of 2 years? Okay, that's very, very challenging subset to take on. Great rewards on the back end of that should you get it right, but nobody has proven that those rewards justify the risks we're going to take right now. So it is, everything that we do in the business I'm in is about risk. Who incurs the risk? What's the risk to mission? What's the risk to force? Is it a risk worth accepting? What I'm having a hard time getting through right now is I'm not seeing the rewards outweigh the risk in those mission critical cases, because we're still on the low consequences one, and see how much more work we have to do to show a high performance solution. Until we're convinced of that, we will get started on some use cases, on sort of autonomous small drone capabilities. Again, lower risk consequences in that case, prove it out, and then figure out where we go from there. So that's my sort of facile answer on that one, but it is a risk reward. I grant you that. I just don't see enough to justify some of the risks on the higher risk missions.
I would just say that that's an interesting answer, because I think in industry that's exactly turned on its head, as per earlier remarks, which is like, you define success to be accuracy on some classification task or on some speech recognition task, and then we're only now finding out about what the risks of doing that are. So it's interesting that in your world things are reversed.
I will say we work with a lot of large enterprises, and what we do see is many of them, they want to get into AI, they know it's changing the world, but when they actually have to roll up their sleeves and get started, they tend to pick areas that are tangential to their business just because it's a little bit less scary. And even if they know by implementing it in kind of the real mission critical, the real kind of high leverage areas within a large business, even if they know the gains could be massive and really transformational and really shake up the competitive landscape in their favor, the end of the day, they're very hesitant to take that risk. And so I think we're just now starting to see in a lot of these large companies that have been doing AI for 4 or 5 years now, them just starting to carefully insert this AI into their real kind of high leverage areas at the core of their business.
The only thing I have to add to that is the work that we've done through various DoD funding agencies, including the Office of Naval Research, has looked at how people perceive risk of autonomous systems and of algorithms. And I think that that is its whole entity of itself, the way that we perceive risk. Humans are not good at judging probabilistic information. And machine learning, deep learning, it's all probabilities. And so, we have research in this area right now going on to actually identify all the points of subjectivity in machine learning, because all of these points of subjectivity potentially are points of risk inside an algorithm. And so how to then, and this goes, I'm sorry to sound like a repeating wheel over and over again, we need to understand testing and certification so that we can identify these points of subjectivity, which are points of risk, so that we can figure out how to mitigate them. That is not to say to do away with them. And I also agree that it's funny, yes, the military is very, very risk concerned. Industry is very, very not risk concerned. And what we really need to have is something in the middle. It would be good, maybe we should have a joint center of risk assessment for AI, because I think that that would be, a lot of lessons could be learned on both sides.
Thank you. So I guess in the interest of spatial fairness.
Thank you.
Yeah, this symposium is advertised to cover 2 aspects of the AI, promise and the risk. But none of the speakers have really gone off and addressed the risk. Sure, most of the speakers have said there's risk and uttered motherhood statements about them, but they really haven't offered much in the way of solutions. The first speaker today was taking the Uber AI killing of an innocent pedestrian to be just a normal startup problem for technology. But he uttered no words at how to prevent ordinary startup problems for AI, say on our nuclear submarines. None of the speakers has addressed how to prevent the bad guys from taking over our AI, be it by the Russians, bots taking over our voting machines and our social media, or the Chinese AI identifying Uyghurs to go off to concentration camps. In this symposium, we've heard no ideas or plans to protect our Navy or our citizens from the bad guys developing their own AI or stealing our AI and turning it back on us. So there are many real-life, inevitable possibilities here of bad guys or bad guys using AI or bad AI, and many of these have, let's say, huge a footprint for many humans and humanity. I came to this symposium hoping and expecting to hear from the speakers about how these problems would be solved. That's the second part of the promise of the topics here. So because this symposium has not addressed half of the problem, the risk, I judge this symposium to be a failure.
Is there a question?
Could you please comment?
So I disagree with the characterization that we haven't been discussing risks and with the characterization that we haven't talked about algorithmic solutions to those risks. I agree that we have not explicitly addressed the risks that you cite, and I don't think that we could possibly address the risks that everybody could have in their minds in a 1.5-hour symposium. So let me agree with you that those are important problems and suggest that the organizers refund his admission.
I would like to also comment on, I just wrote an article that, that was published at the UPenn World Order Symposium a couple of weeks ago.
The Perry World House?
Yes, the Perry World House. I'm sorry, thank you. And there was this issue of, is China really ahead of us in AI? And we could extend that to many other countries. I think these are important questions to ask, but I want to take it back to just the core issues of what we know about AI. When we say that humans really struggle to reason about probabilistic information, I did not say United States American humans. I mean all humans. I take a very laid-back approach about the China problem, if you want to call it there, because I'm a professor, I teach students from around the world. I can tell you they're all terrible. The good news is you should not get into any driverless car anywhere in the world because no student is better than any other student. And I think taking an international perspective, we have huge problems in the quality of AI that is coming out, regardless of whether it's in a driverless car or in a medical system. I do believe that we should be concerned about bad actors who put bad AI that they don't check at all into potential weapon systems. I know the military is thinking about that, right? So there's a lot of topics we just can't talk about in this room, either because of the classification of them or just the time that we have. But I do think that we need to step back and not get overwhelmed and hysterical, just like the artificial general intelligence problem. It is not going to materialize in the way that people are telling you. This idea that China is running amok and is going to have AI capabilities that we don't have, this is also not possible either. I think the bigger problem that the world faces is we're going to have a lot of really bad, mediocre AI in all facets of society, and then how are we going to develop systems that can detect, defend, and mitigate bad AI?
Maybe there's a question over here.
Hi, my name is Chris Daly. I'm class of 2008. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Cummings for bringing up Turcom and DISMAC as a TLAM specialist. I was tickled to hear about my old TLAM technology in the AI revolution scene, which I did not expect. My question is for the general. You mentioned updating algorithms or models at some regular interval in order to maintain accuracy relative to new observations and evidence collected and things like that. Some of the models that we've talked about today, like GPT-2 and ResNet and things like that, some of them can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to train in terms of electricity and specialized hardware and things like that. If you're trying to update a model, let's say hourly, you have to incur that cost every time you do that. And if that does provide some operational edge at whatever level of warfighting, you can expect adversaries to meet in kind. I wonder if you envision a sort of Cold War-style arms race about who can buy more GPUs or who can operate more data centers. And if you do see that, how do you think that's going to change the face of operational planning for the U.S. military?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start by saying I really do avoid the term arms race in this. I think it's unhelpful to go there just because it is largely a commercial technology that has a lot of military applicability. So minor point, but back to what you were saying. This is a really good question on if we envision a future of algorithmic warfare, algorithm against algorithm. Is that a little bit utopia? How far away is that in the future? I believe it's coming at some point where we're talking about temporal advantage because one side has better performing algorithms in some systems, others don't. It doesn't mean that one side wins or loses just by who has a better performing algorithm. But I do see that coming, and then we have to understand what the costs and risks, so 50% failure, we got promise, right? So I'm gonna talk about the other 50% here, what the risks are of getting that wrong. So there are commercial tech analogies of getting these updates fielded at the necessary frequency the more we learn about that, the more we learn how we can control those costs, gains, efficiencies, and now just getting to the point of reasonable returns on investment by constant updates. And what's constant? I don't know right now. The Maven model is they're up to the point where it's monthly updates. And that is a decent point right now, but I think still not quite sufficient for the future. So this gets back into the whole culture change that the department required. Are the rest of our processes, all the rest of our data structures, all the rest of our weapon systems structured so that those regular updates can't even happen in the first place? What does dynamic retraining look like in that future scenario? I don't know entirely yet, but if we don't do it, I go back to what I said earlier. If we throw an algorithm out there, however good or bad it may be, and let's say it's a very good algorithm at the moment it's fielded, in 6 months, it is no longer a good algorithm. Are we prepared to keep it updated? If we don't do so, then I think we're back into the cynicism part of this is it's even worse than not having an algorithm in the first place. So I don't have a perfect answer for you. I think we have to work through what that looks like. Every weapon system is going to look a little bit differently. A process automation update, far more cost effective than, say, putting into one of the big Intel analyst weapon systems. But since I have the mic just for a minute, I will say on the risk piece of it, I'm not going to talk about it here because I can't, but we do think very carefully about what our adversaries are doing in terms of their capabilities. You get a control of our data, you get control of our algorithm, you get control of our model, then you've changed where we're trying to go. So there is a lot we're thinking about in this risk of our algorithms and our data versus what the adversary. So whether you call it counter AI, adversarial AI, and or program protection, we are investing in that significantly because there are risks that we have to take into account. So I do want to mention that. That's as far as I can go in this setting, and I hope that at least tickles your answer, or question a little bit.
Thanks, sir.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Midshipman Set Class Lewis. Many of you spoke today about the importance of being transparent with members of the public about the technology that we have and the capabilities. However, there are inherent risks in both the private and public sector when you let your exact capabilities known. For example, corporate espionage or military risks. So how do you balance the need to be transparent with the risks of losing your competitive edge?
I'll just say from where I sit, you just don't talk operational details. You can talk the big picture of what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, generally where the Department of Defense is trying to go with these technologies. I might have strayed once or twice a little bit too far into some of the operational details of what we were doing, and that may have been sort of a push the ragged boundaries of it. So from now on, what I do is generally talk about just what is the department trying to do with artificial intelligence? What are some of the risks? What are some of the benefits? What are the costs? What are the drawbacks? Keep it at a fairly high level. I do not want to get into operational details for the reasons that you're suggesting. It's operational security. I do not want to give an adversary an advantage free of charge. But I also think it's important. We're spending $760+ billion of taxpayer money. Somebody should know what we're trying to do with the AI portion of that. So it is something we need to talk about, especially in trying to have a tighter relationship with the commercial industry, not all of whom have a vested interest in working with the Department of Defense. Their profit margins are not coming from DoD right now. So we have to have the conversation, just careful about how deep we are going to go into it.
So maybe I'll give a follow-up comment, not so much from the military's perspective, but more from the research or even industrial perspective. So I generally think that the proprietary aspects of machine learning from a competitive standpoint are overrated in the sense that, the basic principles and algorithms that are in use in industry or in academia share much more similarity than they do differences. So, anytime I'm asked by a venture capital friend to evaluate a startup company, present company accepted, that tells me like, our algorithm is highly proprietary. What's special about our machine learning is not the data that we worked really hard to get and to clean and understand at scale. nor is it the production process, but it's really a magic algorithm. Like, you know, nobody's ever seen an algorithm like this. It's totally different than backpropagation. It's totally different than support vector machines. I'm deeply suspicious of that, and I have not yet had that suspicion sort of countered by sort of, you know, when they opened up the kimono, I'm like, wow, you know, never seen anything like that before. You know, and the truth of the matter is, to a first approximation, like if you've got good data, if you've got data with features that are predictive of the thing that you're trying to predict, lots of stuff will work reasonably well, okay? And then, like, you know, the secret sauce is just a lot of artisanal tinkering and engineering. And I'm not dismissing that, but I think in terms of balancing transparency with the public about the way machine learning works, versus, you know, large tech companies that often, for instance, try to counter suggestions for greater regulation that, like, oh, we couldn't possibly tell you anything about that because that's our proprietary intellectual property. I don't buy it, right? And so maybe at some point I'll see an example where, like, wow, you know, yeah, they really shouldn't have been forced to show that, you know. But I've just never seen it happen, okay? And I'm not claiming that there's not IP in these companies or being generated in academia, but I think that we are so far from the line of infringing on that with respect to explaining AI and machine learning to the general public that we have a long way to go before we're going to be trampling on anybody's intellectual property.
I'd like to add that that problem that you're talking about is the reason that driverless cars are going to go effectively bankrupt in the next 1 to 2 years. That's because the companies are so hyper-competitive with one another that they're having difficulty solving these problems, yet if they would be more open with each other, sharing their approaches, sharing their problems, the driverless car community might make a lot more advances if they would work more collaboratively. In the military world, I see that a lot across the services, that there is still a lot of stovepiping in the services, that, you know, some Air Force group doesn't want to tell what the Navy's group is doing. And I have to tell you, the Army is so far behind everyone. Sorry, there's no one on this. But it's true. And then what happens is this whole hyper-competitiveness of, like, oh, well, our program, our research program is doing something better. What it would be really great, and this goes back to the talent problem, is if the military had a very highly tuned crowd of people who could do these kinds of assessments within the scales of classification and other contracting limits. So that's how you get experience. That's how, when you go to see a company, and when I'm called to do VC startup, inspections, that we're both, that's how we know, like, because we see a little bit of what's going on the inside, and we're like, oh, that's nothing. I think the military definitely, and that's why the JAIC is so important, but I think the JAIC probably needs a lot more people that can do that.
Yeah, no question. But right, I agree completely that we need to do that.
I'm going to defer to that midshipman over there, so she gets a good grade.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ma'am and gentlemen. I have a question. I'm Midshipman First Class Cherry John. In the future, what is the biggest legal issue the military will face upon use of true AI?
I didn't quite hear that.
Could you repeat that question? I don't think we got that.
In the future, what is the biggest legal issue the military will face upon use of true AI?
There is not one. There are hundreds of
Yes.
legal considerations. To call one above all, I guess I'd fall back on what seems to be the rage right now of talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems and the idea of a machine making a decision that takes a human life, which is not something we're talking about right now. We have very definite policy constraints on our use of autonomy in weapon systems. But legally, that would be addressed just like any other legal part of artificial intelligence for DoD. So I don't see any one, but part of our solution is just beginning to understand what the range of legal concerns are when fielding. We have fielded emerging technologies in the Department of Defense for as long as we've been at Department of Defense. There have been legal concerns with every one of those. We've addressed all of them using a framework which the department has to do with lawful, ethical, and safe use of X technology. AI is similar in many respects to other technologies, but it does have some core differences that have already been raised on this panel. What are the legal considerations to address those is what you're really getting at. And I think we're only now beginning to sort of dive in and understand on the weapon system side of this, what does that look like? But beyond that, I deal with everything every day, from intellectual property protections to is it even legal to use this contract vehicle? I mean, there are very mundane things that we deal with. I think the taking of life and machines, quote unquote, making decisions that result in high consequence for humans is one of the most important things that we're taking into account. And I'm struggling a little bit because it's all of the above. It's not any single one.
I could add about the lethal autonomous weapons, because this is it's a hot button issue that's getting a lot of press globally, because Stuart Russell and others the Future of Life Institute is advocating for a complete ban on autonomous weapons. And you've heard it from the horse's mouth that the military is not interested in letting these things loose on society. And there are a lot of tricky issues that need to be thought about. So I think claiming that we should have bans is really not an instructive way. It's not very helpful dialogue going forward. I think really what we need to think about is, what is the technology doing? What would it mean to have a ban on what is functionally software? I mean, which is the barrier to entry is nothing. Everyone can have software. And I've recently written a piece that's coming out in the IEEE Technology and Society magazine as a former fighter pilot that says, look, there is a case to be made by today's standards that automated weapons, not even AI, with just a tiny bit of target recognition against static targets makes less errors than human pilots do. I've been there. I've been in training missions. I have done blue-on-blue engagements where I have killed the other pilot in front of me. Time stress, understanding or misunderstanding of the symbology inside the cockpit, bad intelligence that was given to you in the brief fuzzy pictures that you weren't really sure what was happening. And so I think that we need to think from a functional perspective, what are humans capable of? What should we be asking human warfighters to do? Can technology reliably exceed their capabilities? It is my personal opinion that for static target bombing, that is buildings, bridges, that automated technologies, automated, not AI, should be able to do that. Whereas in dynamic targeting situations with a lot more uncertainty, we are nowhere close. This is a very hot button issue, so I would refer you to my paper on my website that you can read. But I think this is a good example of it's not as clear. You just can't draw that fine line and cleanly divide what is good and bad about these weapons.
Thank you.
My name is Mike Mann. I'm an old sailor. One of the most difficult things we ask sailors on ships and submarines to do is to identify and detect submarines, recognize they have a submarine contact. And I've always thought that AI is the key to that capability. We've all seen the movie Hunt for Red October. Jonesy was able to identify a submarine he hadn't heard before, and to the degree that his captain was confident in his identification. And I've always felt like we could solve this problem with AI or maybe automation. So I'd like to ask the panel, is it unreasonable to think we could solve a simple problem like that? Dr. Kearns, you said that you can write an algorithm to accomplish an outcome as long as it's a discrete outcome. Couldn't we do that with that kind of recognition of a submarine?
Well, of course, I'm going to defer to my military colleagues for the details of submarine detection, which is a problem I haven't worked on. But I mean, in the language of sort of identifying an objective function, I think that, often that's the hard, once you can do that and get it right, then much of the rest of machine learning becomes easier. And sort of as per earlier comments by all of us, if you get that wrong, then you're kind of optimizing for the wrong thing and all kinds of collateral damage can occur. I guess, if you wanted to apply modern machine learning methods, the first thing you would need is a very large corpus of images of submarines, under all kinds of lighting and other conditions. And I do not know if that image corpus exists, but that's kind of, the ante in machine learning or deep learning of the modern variety is, an extraordinary amount of data from the domain, and then sort of being able to write down what it is you're trying to optimize. So, probably many people in the audience know the perhaps apocryphal but instructive story of the efforts by the military to do aerial spotting of camouflaged tanks, in the woods, probably somewhere not too far from here, and using kind of the perceptron algorithm. And they, went out and they had this, what we would now consider to be a very, very tiny training set, but a bunch of positive examples of images that were known to contain camouflage tanks because the Army put them there and camouflaged them, and a bunch of images in the same woods where there were no camouflage tanks. And there was great excitement, when the perceptron solved this task extremely well. And then the military said, well, let's see how well it generalizes. So they went out and took some more photos of, tanks and non-tanks, and the model performed horribly. And then they realized, well, in the first data set, all of the camouflage tank images were taken on a cloudy day, and all of the images without tanks and then were taken on a sunny day. And so what really the model had learned was to detect shadows, right? It didn't, and this is kind of a truism about machine learning, which is, often in a problem like submarine detection, the only way we know it's possible is that people are able to do it, right? But there might be a lot of solutions for the way that you phrase the problem. So, the perceptron algorithm didn't know that the task was to detect tanks. It found another way of solving the same problem, which is detecting light and shadow between these two sets of images. But that's, of course, not what was intended. And so,
I'd just like to add, I'm with you on this one. I'm trying to do acoustic drone detection with machine learning algorithms right now. It's actually not funded by the military. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, because we have a big problem with drones dropping contraband into prison yards. And prisons would like to know when there are drones coming. And you know what? Our algorithm worked great in training. It worked great when we took it out to the first prison. And then when we took it out to the second prison, it turns out that weed eaters and leaf blowers sound just like drones. And so it's this problem of, in all machine learning algorithms, it's not a signal to noise problem, it's a noise to signal problem.
All I'll say is we call that one ping learning. There's. Yes, your instincts are correct, and that's all I will say.
Okay, I think this will be our last question.
Hi, how are you? I'm Captain Paul. I work in the computer science department here. With some of the leading commercial companies showing significant reservations or even a complete refusal to work with the DoD on AI-related projects, do you think that will impact American military competitive edge against our peers? And for those folks from the academia and commercial sectors, do you think these companies have a right or in right thinking in that refusal to work with the DoD on these type of projects?
Well, there's a lot there. We were talking about this back in the green room, so I know Missy will have some things to say on this. I'd say in general terms, we have some work to do to repair some relationships with industry, academia, and government. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about being a little bit more transparent about what the department is doing and why. Some of the biggest commercial industries in this sphere are almost nation state in some respects, almost sovereign in their global responsibilities. Very different than it was 25 years ago with sort of the standard defense contracting, who still exists, but you've got this different world that's out there today. I would say that in general terms, there seems to be a willingness to want to try to work with the military. You'll see everything from startup companies and big companies explicitly saying, we're here to work with the Department of Defense. I mean, that is their business model. It's a little dangerous, actually, to have that solely as your business model, but some say it that way. Others will say, we want to work with the department, but just understand we have an internal review process, like we would do for anybody, to decide, is it in the ethical best interest of this company to take on this project? What we had a little bit of a hard time with one of the companies, with you draw a stark line and you'd say, we will do everything up to this line, but we won't go further than that. It's really hard to draw a line when the technology is even more commercial than it is military, and what you can use it for in intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance one day versus cat videos on the next. How do I make that distinction in such a way that everybody understands where that line is? It's very hard for us to do. What I'm interested in doing is work with companies that want to work with the Department of Defense. I think what Missy was saying earlier, as we were back on the other side of this, at the highest levels, at the CEO level and high-level management, there is great optimism about working with the Department of Defense. I'm not sure that optimism exists all the way down to the worker level, and we experienced that with Project Maven. How do we deal with that? It's a tough one. It's not me going out, it's my peer, it's the 03 captain that's in here with me today going out and having those conversations with his peers. I do find that if we don't get this right, we will be at a disadvantage. And I'm not trying to say the China model is the right model, but they have this idea of military-civil fusion, which is a societal way of coming at the problem that is different than ours. Good, bad, it's just different, and I think it gives them an advantage in some respects in artificial intelligence because of access to data, access to algorithms. We have a lot of work to do. I know we're running out of time, so I'll leave it at that. Generally, I'm an optimist, but we have to keep pressing this pretty hard.
I would like to echo all of that and to say that I think these last couple of years have been not just politically divisive in this country. I have actually seen more personal discrimination to my face as a professor in academia by other academics because I was both in the military and take military research. In my entire 20 years as an academic, I've never faced just the raw derision that I face. Really, people will say to me in meetings, you know, you're just a baby killer or something along those lines. How can you do that? How could you have been in the military? How could you do military research? And I chalk up the latest spike in this to the political divisiveness that we see across the country. And so I think tensions are high all around. You know, I graduated from here in the 80s. I think the country's attitude towards business attitudes towards taking business with the military was one of honor. Whereas today, certainly, and I spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley, it's just not that way. And so I think that it's a bigger problem that's not just in terms of the AI and the military, but largely a reflection of the divisiveness of the country in general.
Okay, well, I think we have to, because of time, stop here. But I want to thank our entire panel, led by Dr. Crabbe and paneled by General Shanahan, Dr. Cummings, Dr. Kearns, and Mr. Adam Wenchel. I think it was very entertaining. I enjoyed the back and forth very much, and I think a lot of really good, important points came out here at the end that needed to come out, and we thank our panelists for that thoughtful discussion. Let's give them a big hand. I'd also like to thank our audience today for staying with us through a good program. We enjoy very much this partnership between the Naval Institute and the Naval Academy, and especially want to thank again the Computer Science Department, and our lead there for coordination was Chris Brown, Dr. Chris Brown, but also his colleagues, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Crabbe, Dr. Chambers, and Dr. McDowell. And finally, I just want to thank again our sponsors, the William M. Wood Foundation, for helping make this possible. We thank you and have a wonderful day.